My neighbor's daughter knocked on my door at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night and said, "I need a husband by Friday." I stood there with a dish towel still in my hand and thought I had misheard her. I hadn't. "Hi, my name is Caleb Reeves. I'm 33 years old and I run the only veterinary clinic in Cedar Creek, Montana, a town small enough that everyone knows whose dog limps and whose cattle calved late this spring. I've lived alone for 3 years, since my engagement to a woman named Dana ended the way these things sometimes do, quietly, then all at once, over a decision about whether either of us actually wanted the life we'd been planning or had just stopped questioning it. I keep busy. Mornings are calls and surgeries, evenings are paperwork, and a dog named Otis who isn't mine but adopted me anyway after his owner moved to Bozeman and never quite got around to taking him. My neighbor's daughter is named Sophie Lindquist. I'd known her the way you know a neighbor's kid, a wave across the fence line, a Christmas card exchanged with her uncle Henrik, who'd sponsored her initial move to the States, the occasional sight of her driving into town for groceries. She was 24, originally from Sweden, finishing a graduate degree in wildlife biology at the State University 40 minutes south. I knew that much. I didn't know much else, until that Tuesday night, when she stood on my porch and told me her student visa expired in 11 days, and that the only way she'd found to stay legally was to be married by Friday. She said the word like it cost her something to say it. Her flight back to Sweden was already booked for the following week, in case she couldn't find a way to stop it. I asked her to come inside. She hesitated, the kind of hesitation that comes from a person who has had to ask strangers for things before, and has learned that the asking rarely goes the way you hope. She sat at my kitchen table. I made coffee because making coffee is what I do when I don't know what else to do with my hands. She told me the rest of it in pieces, the way people tell you things when they're testing whether you'll still be listening by the end. Her student visa was tied to her enrollment. She'd finished her coursework in August, early, ahead of her cohort, and the grace period after graduation was running out faster than she'd planned for. A postdoctoral position she'd been counting on, a research fellowship with a wildlife conservation nonprofit in Missoula, had fallen through 3 weeks earlier when the funding collapsed. Without that position, without a new visa sponsor, she had no legal path to stay. "Why does it matter so much?" I asked. "Couldn't you just go home and reapply? Come back next year?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me about her father, not Henrik, her actual father, back in Sweden, a man named Lennart Lindquist who ran a shipping company and had very specific ideas about what his daughter's life should look like. An arranged understanding with a business associate's son, a wedding that had been discussed since she was 19, postponed twice by her leaving for university in America. And now, if she returned home without a degree finished and a job secured, an arrangement her father would consider finally settled. "He's not cruel," she said. "He just doesn't understand that I already decided. If I go back now, with nothing to show for it, he'll say I tried and failed, and it's time to be reasonable. He'll have the wedding planned within a month. And you don't want that. I have spent 6 years building a life he can't fold into his plans," she said. "If I go home now, I lose all of it." She looked at me directly for the first time since she'd sat down. "I know this is an enormous thing to ask a near stranger, I know it. But Henrik said you were the most decent man on this road, and I am very nearly out of road." I told her I needed to think. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat on my own porch with Otis and thought about what it meant to marry someone, legally, on paper, a contract witnessed by a county clerk, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with a visa deadline and a father 7,000 miles away who thought he still owned his daughter's future. I thought about Dana. I thought about how the last real conversation we'd had was about whether we were choosing each other or just failing to choose anything else. I'd spent 3 years since then assuming marriage was something I'd gotten wrong once and didn't trust myself to consider again. But this wasn't that. This was simpler and somehow heavier. A woman needed a legal status. I had the ability to provide one. The rest, what people would think, what it would cost either of us emotionally, felt like a separate question from whether it was the right thing to do. I called Henrik the next morning, not to ask permission, to understand what I was actually walking into. He confirmed everything. He'd known about the visa problem for 2 weeks and hadn't known what to do about it himself. He said Sophie hadn't asked him for help because she didn't want him caught between his daughter and the family back home he still had complicated ties to. She's not asking lightly, Henrik said. She's not the kind of person who asks for things lightly. If she came to your door, it's because she ran out of other doors. I drove to Sophie's rental that afternoon. She opened the door already braced for a no. I'll do it, I said. But we do this properly. Real paperwork, real terms, both of us protected. And you should know, I'm not doing this because I expect anything back. I'm doing it because 11 days isn't enough time for a person to lose 6 years of work over a family arrangement she never agreed to. She stood very still in the doorway. Why? She asked. Why would you do this for someone you barely know? I thought about it honestly before I answered. Because I have the ability to help, and not helping seemed like the worst decision. She didn't say thank you right away. She just nodded like she was filing the answer away to examine later. Then she said we should call a lawyer. I don't want either of us exposed if anyone asks questions. That was the first thing she said that made me think this might actually work. She wasn't asking me to be reckless. She was asking me to be careful with her, the same way I'd be careful with anyone I cared about not hurting. We were married on Thursday morning at the county courthouse in Bozeman, 1 day ahead of her deadline, with Henrik and the clerk's assistant as witnesses. Sophie wore a plain green dress she said was the nicest thing she owned that wasn't covered in field research dust. I wore the one suit I kept for funerals, which felt like an uncomfortable thing to notice in the moment, but which I noticed anyway. The ceremony took 11 minutes. The clerk read the standard language in a flat, efficient voice that suggested she'd done this exact thing 1,000 times for 1,000 different reasons. When it came time for rings, neither of us had thought to buy any. We'd been too consumed with paperwork. So Henrik, who had apparently anticipated this, produced 2 plain silver bands he'd bought that morning without telling either of us. You'll want something, he said simply, even if it's only for show. Sophie's hand was steady when I slid the ring on. Mine wasn't, which she noticed, and which she didn't comment on, which I appreciated more than I could have explained. We signed the immigration paperwork that same afternoon. A joint petition, financial documentation, a sworn statement of cohabitation that meant, practically speaking, Sophie needed to move into my house, at least on paper, at least for now. I have a guest room, I told her, in the truck on the way back to Cedar Creek. It's small, but it's yours as long as you need it. I'll take the lease on your apartment off your hands if that helps. No reason to pay for 2 places. You don't have to do that. I know, I said. I'm doing it anyway. The first weeks were careful in the particular way that 2 strangers living under a legal arrangement learn to be careful. Sophie kept to the guest room mostly, came down for coffee in the mornings, spent her days at the university finishing the last of her degree requirements and applying for any position that might offer a new visa sponsorship before her temporary status, now tied to our marriage, came up for its own review in 2 years. I learned her habits without trying to. She took her coffee black, no sugar, and drank it too fast, like she'd learned somewhere that lingering over things wasn't a luxury she could count on. She left her boots by the back door, always lined up the same way, heels against the wall. She talked to Otis in Swedish sometimes when she thought no one was listening, which I only knew because I'd heard her through the kitchen window more than once and never mentioned it. She learned my habits too, that I left for the clinic at 6 and was almost always back smelling like antiseptic and hay, that I made too much coffee every morning out of old habit from when there had been someone else to share it with, that I didn't talk about Dana, and that the one photograph of us still on the bookshelf in the living room was something she noticed on her first night and never once asked about. That restraint mattered more to me than I expected it to. 3 weeks in, Sophie found me at the kitchen table going through a stack of insurance paperwork for the clinic, frustrated in the specific way that only paperwork can frustrate a person who is otherwise perfectly capable. She sat down across from me without asking and started sorting the pile into categories before I'd even explained what I needed. You don't have to do this, I said. I know, she said, not looking up. I'm doing it anyway. I looked at her for a second too long. She'd used my own words back at me, deliberately, with the faintest trace of a smile she was trying not to show. It was the first time I laughed in her presence without meaning to. There was a Saturday in early October when a rancher named Pete Volkov brought in a horse with a deep laceration along its flank. Barbed wire, the kind of injury that requires patience as much as skill, since a frightened animal in pain will fight the very treatment meant to help it. Sophie had been at the clinic since dawn, and she was the one who managed to calm the horse enough for me to work, standing at its head and murmuring something low and rhythmic that I later learned was a Swedish folk song her grandmother used to sing to spooked sheepdogs. The horse settled. I closed the wound. Pete, gruff and not given to compliments, watched the whole thing and said only, "She's got a gift." After Pete left, Sophie sat on an overturned feed bucket, exhausted in the particular way that comes after holding your nerves steady for someone else's benefit. I brought her water and sat down across from her on another bucket, which made us look, I imagined, like two people having a very serious conversation in a barn, which in fairness we were. "You're good with frightened things," I said. "Frightened things make sense to me," she said. "They don't pretend the fear isn't there. People do that. Animals don't bother." I thought about that for a while. "Is that why you went into wildlife work instead of something with people?" "Partly," she said. "Mostly I just like things that are honest about what they need." She looked at me then, the kind of look that lingers half a second longer than a casual one does, and I felt something shift slightly in my chest that I didn't examine too closely that night, because examining it felt like more than I was ready to do. We didn't talk about it. We just finished the evening chores together in the easy quiet that had become, without either of us deciding on it, the most comfortable part of most days. By the second month, the arrangement had developed a shape neither of us had planned for, but both of us had quietly accepted. Sophie started helping at the clinic on Saturdays. She had a steadier hand with frightened animals than half my trained staff. A patience that came, she said, from years of fieldwork, tracking wolves that didn't care whether you were patient or not. I started leaving her research papers from journals I didn't fully understand because she'd mentioned once, in passing, that she missed having someone to talk shop with. We developed evening habits. She'd sit on the back porch with her laptop, finishing her thesis. I'd sit with the clinic's books or a beer or nothing at all, just the quiet. Otis claimed a spot between us, one he refused to relinquish to either of us individually. One evening in late October, with the first real frost settling over the valley, Sophie closed her laptop and said, without preamble, "My father called today." I set down what I was reading. "What did he say?" "He found out about the marriage. Henrik must have mentioned it to my mother, and my mother can't keep anything from him." She looked at the frost forming on the porch railing. "He's furious. He says I've embarrassed the family. He says marrying a stranger to avoid a deportation is exactly the kind of impulsive thing he always worried I'd do." "What did you tell him?" "I told him it wasn't impulsive," she said. "I told him I'd thought about it very carefully, and that you were not a stranger anymore, and that this was my decision and would remain my decision regardless of what he thought of it." She was quiet for a moment. "He hung up on me. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said the only thing I had. I'm sorry he reacted that way." "Don't be," she said. "He's reacted this way to every decision I've made since I was 17. I'm sorry you got pulled into it." "I'm not," I said, and meant it more than I expected to. Lennart Lindquist arrived in Cedar Creek in November, 3 days after Thanksgiving, without calling ahead. I was at the clinic when Sophie texted me, 3 words, "He's here, come home." And I left a half-finished surgical consult with my assistant and drove the 11 minutes back to the house faster than the speed limit strictly allowed. Lennart was standing in my living room when I arrived, a tall man in an expensive coat that looked entirely wrong against the backdrop of Otis's dog bed and the second-hand furniture Dana and I had bought years ago and I'd never replaced. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he has already decided is beneath his consideration. "You're the veterinarian," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am. My daughter tells me this marriage is real." He said the word real like it tasted unpleasant. "I find that difficult to believe given the timeline." "The timeline was forced by circumstance," I said. "That doesn't make the marriage less legitimate. It makes it convenient," he said, "for her. I'm sure it's been convenient for you as well. Free help around your clinic, a young woman in your home." Sophie's voice came sharp from the doorway. "Don't!" Lennart turned to her. "I came here to bring you home, Sophie. There is still time to fix this." An annulment, a quiet return. "No one needs to know the details." "I'm not coming home," she said. "There is nothing to fix. I am married, I have a life here, and I am not interested in the plans you've made for me without asking." You will lose everything, he said. The company, your inheritance, your place in this family. I have already lost the version of myself that needed those things to feel like I belonged somewhere, Sophie said. Her voice was shaking now, but she didn't stop. I found that somewhere else. I found it here. Lennart looked between the two of us for a long moment. Then he looked at the small house, the dog, the modest furniture, with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Something between contempt and, very faintly, something else. You're throwing away an empire for this, he said quietly. For a small house and a man who fixes farm animals. I'm not throwing anything away, Sophie said. I'm choosing something you never gave me the option to choose for myself. He left within the hour. He didn't say goodbye to either of us. Christmas came quietly that year. Sophie had no family to spend it with. Her mother called once, brief and apologetic, caught between her husband's anger and her daughter's choices, unable to bridge the distance either way. And I hadn't done much for the holiday in the 3 years since Dana, beyond a token tree I put up out of habit and took down a week later without much ceremony. This year Sophie put up the tree herself, 3 days before Christmas, while I was at the clinic dealing with a calving emergency that ran late into the night. When I got home past midnight, exhausted and smelling like a barn, the living room was lit with small white lights, and the tree stood in the corner where Dana's photograph used to be the only thing anyone noticed. Sophie was asleep on the couch, a half-finished mug of tea on the side table, a field guide to North American wolves open on her chest. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at the room, at what it had become without my really noticing the transformation happening day by day. I didn't wake her. I got a blanket from the hall closet and laid it over her, carefully, the way you do something you don't want to interrupt. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. On Christmas morning she'd left a small wrapped package on the kitchen table with my name on it in handwriting I was starting to recognize without needing to look at the signature. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, replacement for the one I'd been using for clinic notes, the one with a cracked spine I'd been meaning to replace for 2 years and never had. You mentioned it once, she said when I thanked her. In October. You probably don't remember. I don't, I admitted. But you did. I noticed things, she said simply, and went back to her coffee, as if that wasn't the most quietly significant thing anyone had said to me in 3 years. There was a week in January I think about often, mostly because nothing happened in it, which was exactly the point. Sophie's thesis publication came back from peer review with revisions, nothing major, mostly clarifications, the ordinary bureaucracy of academic work. She spent 4 straight evenings at the kitchen table with her laptop and 3 different colored pens, muttering occasionally in Swedish in a tone that needed no translation. I worked beside her most of those evenings, going through my own paperwork, refilling her coffee without being asked the same way she'd started refilling mine. Otis split his loyalty evenly, which felt, by that point, like the correct and fair arrangement. On the 4th night, she finally closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair with the specific exhaustion of finishing something that had taken longer than it should have. Done, she said, submitted. That deserves something better than coffee, I said. What do you want? She thought about it, genuinely, like the question mattered more than its size suggested. I want to walk down to the creek, she said. It's probably frozen solid, but I want to see it anyway. It was 9 at night in January in Montana, which meant it was somewhere around 10 degrees outside, which meant walking to the creek was objectively a strange thing to want. I didn't say that. I got our coats. The creek was indeed frozen solid, the ice catching what little moonlight made it through the clouds, the whole valley quiet in the specific way only deep winter produces. A quiet that isn't empty so much as held, like the land is saving its energy for spring. We stood there for a while, not saying much, our breath visible in the cold. Sophie reached over at some point and took my hand, not dramatically, just simply, the way you reach for something that's already become familiar. I used to do this at home, she said. Walk to water in the cold, just to remember the world was bigger than whatever was bothering me that day. Does it still work? Tonight it does, she said. We walked back to the house in the dark, her hand still in mine, neither of us in any particular hurry to get back to the warmth, which said more about where we'd arrived than either of us was ready to say out loud yet. That night, after Lennart's rental car had disappeared down the long gravel road, Sophie sat on the porch steps with her knees pulled up to her chest, and for the first time since she'd knocked on my door 11 weeks earlier, she cried without trying to hide it. I sat down beside her, not too close. I'd learned by then the specific distance she needed in moments like this. "I'm sorry," I said. "For what?" "That you had to choose between him and the life you wanted. No one should have to make that choice." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I made the choice a long time ago," she said. Tonight was just the first time I said it to his face. We sat there for a while in silence, the frost thickening on the grass. Otis pressed against her leg the way he did when he understood, in his limited and devoted way, that something had happened that mattered. "Caleb," she said eventually. "Yeah, thank you for not flinching when he said those things about you. About this being convenient." I thought about it before I answered. "It stopped being convenient a long time ago," I said. "Somewhere around the 3rd week, when you started doing my insurance paperwork without being asked." She let out a small, surprised laugh, wet with the leftover tears but real. "That's a strange place to mark the beginning of something." "Most beginnings are stranger than people admit afterward," I said. Winter settled hard over Cedar Creek the way it always did, and the marriage that had started as paperwork settled into something neither of us examined too closely, for fear of what naming it might do to it. Sophie finished her thesis in December. Wolf migration patterns across 3 counties, data she'd spent 2 years collecting on foot in conditions I couldn't imagine being patient enough to survive. She defended it over video call with her committee back at the university, and I sat in the next room pretending not to listen and listening to every word anyway. When she came out afterward, her face was doing something between disbelief and relief. "I passed," she said, "with distinction. They want to publish the dataset." I didn't think about it. I just picked her up off the floor in a hug that surprised both of us. And when I set her back down, we were both laughing. And for one unguarded second, neither of us pulled away first. That was the moment I understood, with the particular clarity that arrives all at once after weeks of slowly not noticing, that I had stopped thinking of this as an arrangement sometime in November, and had not told her, possibly because I had not fully told myself. I didn't say anything that night, but I started paying closer attention to the things I'd been doing without naming them. The second cup of coffee I made every morning before I'd even admitted to myself it wasn't habit anymore, it was for her. The way I'd started timing my drive home from the clinic so I'd catch her on the back porch before the light went. The fact that I'd quietly reached out 3 weeks earlier to a former colleague who now worked for a federal wildlife agency and mentioned, without telling Sophie, that there was a researcher in Montana whose thesis work on wolf migration was, in my admittedly unprofessional opinion, the best thing he'd see cross his desk all year. I hadn't told her about that email. I told myself I'd mention it if anything came of it. Something came of it in February. Sophie got a call from the Federal Wildlife Agency's regional office, a research position, fully funded, with a visa sponsorship that would replace the marriage-based status entirely if she wanted it to. It was, professionally, everything she had been chasing before the fellowship in Missoula fell through. Better even, more secure. She came to find me at the clinic, practically vibrating with the kind of disbelief that comes after months of bad news followed by one piece of good news too large to immediately trust. "They want to interview me next week," she said. "How did they even find my thesis? It's not published yet." I kept my face as neutral as I could manage, which apparently wasn't neutral enough, because she stopped halfway through her excitement and looked at me directly. "Caleb, yeah. Did you do something?" I set down the chart I was holding. "I sent your abstract to a colleague back in November. I didn't think it would actually go anywhere. I should have told you." She was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet I'd learned to read as her sorting through several reactions before choosing one. "You didn't tell me," she said. "Because you would have said no," I said. "You've spent your whole life being handed things by people with agendas. I didn't want to be one more person deciding things for you. Then why do it at all?" I looked at her. "Because your work deserved to be seen, and I had a way to make sure it was. And I decided that mattered more than waiting for permission I wasn't sure you'd give me." She studied me for a long moment, then, quietly, "That's not the same as deciding for me. That's just believing in something before I let myself." I didn't have an answer for that. She didn't seem to need one. The interview went well. The job offer came 2 weeks later. Full sponsorship, her own visa, no longer tied to our marriage or to anyone else's permission. We sat at the kitchen table the night the offer arrived, the contract printed, and sitting between us like something neither of us wanted to be the first to address directly. "This changes things," Sophie said finally. "It does," I agreed. "You don't need the marriage anymore. Not for the visa." I looked at the contract, at the careful, official language that had started all of this 11 weeks, now closer to 4 months, earlier. "No," I said, "I don't suppose I do." She was quiet. Outside, the snow had started again, the kind that falls heavy and silent and makes the whole valley feel like it's holding its breath. "So what happens now?" she asked. I thought about Dana, about the version of myself that had spent 3 years assuming he'd gotten the entire concept of partnership wrong and didn't trust himself to try it again. I thought about a woman who did my insurance paperwork without being asked, who talked to my dog in Swedish, who had stood in my living room and told her father she'd chosen something he never gave her permission to choose. "I think," I said carefully, "that depends on whether you want this to keep being a marriage on paper or something else." She looked up. "What's the something else?" "The kind where neither of us is staying because we have to," I said. "The kind where you'd choose it even with the visa already sorted." She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I started to wonder if I'd overstepped something neither of us had agreed to examine. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, the same hand that had been shaking on our wedding day while hers stayed steady. "I've been choosing it since the 3rd week," she said. "Around the same time you started believing my insurance paperwork was a fair trade for free room and board." I laughed. "The real kind. The kind that arrives before you decide to let it." "That's a strange place to mark the beginning of something." "You said that already," she said. "I'm aware. It's still true." Spring arrived in Cedar Creek the way it always did. Abruptly, after months of pretending it never would, the snow retreating almost overnight to reveal mud and the first green shoots along the fence lines. Sophie's garden plans, which had existed only as sketches in a notebook through the worst of January, finally became something we could actually put hands to. We spent a Saturday in April turning over the soil along the south side of the house, an activity neither of us was particularly skilled at, which led to more laughing than gardening for most of the morning. Sophie kept stopping to identify wildflowers pushing up through the disturbed earth, narrating their Latin names with the automatic precision of someone whose brain simply worked that way. "You know an alarming amount about plants for someone who studies wolves," I said. "Wolves eat things that eat plants," she said. "It's all connected. You'd know that if you paid attention to anything that wasn't a sick cow." "I pay attention to plenty," I said. "I pay attention to you." It came out more directly than I'd planned, and for a second neither of us moved, kneeling in the half-turned dirt, with garden gloves on and a half-planted row of something between us. Sophie looked at me for a long moment, her expression doing something complicated, surprise, then something warmer underneath it. "I know," she said finally. "I've known for a while." "How long?" "Long enough that I started planning a garden at a house I wasn't sure I'd still be living in by spring." I sat back on my heels. "You planned a garden anyway." "I told you," she said. "I notice things, and I decided I wanted to be wrong about leaving." We didn't finish the planting that day. We sat in the dirt instead, hands still gloved, and talked about nothing important until the light went gold and then gray, and Otis came to find us, confused about why dinner was late, which eventually reminded us that the rest of the world still existed beyond that particular patch of ground. We didn't have a second wedding. We talked about it once, briefly, and decided the first one, 11 minutes at a county courthouse, mismatched rings bought that morning by a worried uncle, a dress covered in invisible field dust, was the one that actually mattered, even though neither of us had understood that at the time. What we did instead that following spring was plant a garden along the side of the house that Sophie had been eyeing since her first week in the guest room, Back when she still called it the guest room instead of just her room. Back before either of us had stopped keeping track of which words we were using carefully. She kept the federal research position. She drove out 3 days a week to track wolf populations across the county line, and came home most evenings smelling like pine and cold air, with stories about animals that didn't care whether you understood them, which she told at the kitchen table while I made dinner badly and she ate it anyway. Otis adopted her fully, with the casual disloyalty of dogs everywhere, though he still slept at the foot of my bed on nights she worked late, which felt like its own kind of compromise neither of us had negotiated. Her father called twice more that year. The conversations were shorter each time, and by autumn there was something in his voice. Not warmth exactly, but the beginning of a grudging recognition that his daughter's life had not, in fact, fallen apart the way he'd predicted. One evening in late September, almost exactly a year after she'd knocked on my door with a sentence she'd clearly rehearsed too many times to count, Sophie sat on the back porch watching the last of the light go down over the ridge and said, without looking up from her tea, "Do you remember the first thing I ever said to you?" "I need a husband by Friday," I said. "You said it like it physically hurt to ask." "It did," she said. "I'd never asked anyone for anything that large before." She turned to look at me, and the porch light caught something steady and certain in her expression that hadn't been there that first Tuesday night. Something that had been built slowly across a year of insurance paperwork and stolen abstracts, and a frost-covered porch where a father had once tried to take his daughter home and failed. "I didn't just need a husband," she said. "I found one." I reached over and took her hand, the same way I had on the night the job offer arrived. The same way that had stopped being a gesture of comfort somewhere in the months between and had become something else entirely. "For the record," I said, "I'm glad it was Friday and not some other day. I might have talked myself out of it by Saturday." She laughed, the full one, the one that had taken months to arrive and now came easily, the way things do once you stop bracing for them to disappear. Otis settled between our feet on the porch boards, exactly where he always settled. Exactly where he seemed to think he belonged. Outside, the ridge went dark, and the valley held the particular quiet of a place where, almost a year earlier, a desperate arrangement had slowly, carefully, without either of us quite noticing the moment it happened, become a marriage worth keeping.